Hello and welcome to the Unit 5 podcast, Chocolate and First Contact. The learning outcomes for this unit are: number 1, understand the historical context for European exploration. Number 2, discuss first contact and its consequences for native peoples and Europeans. Number 3, define the concept of Columbian Exchange. Number 4, discuss the first impressions Europeans had for the chocolate drink. And number 5, understand the concept of cross-cultural exchange. If you recall from our previous podcasts, at the time of first contact, the Americas had been isolated for at least 10,000 years from the Old World. The cultures and technologies of the New and Old Worlds diverged and developed independently. For example, agriculture was independently invented in both worlds, but other technologies did not. The two worlds were also isolated on a biological level. At first contact, these two worlds would collide with tremendous consequences. Now, when most people first learn about first contact in school, it is usually in context of Christopher Columbus's epic voyage in 1492 on behalf of the Spanish. The familiar saying is, "In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue." Columbus was trying to reach India and China by a new sea route when he ran smack dab into a brand new continent. However, he thought he succeeded, and in fact he called the native peoples he encountered Indians, a name which stuck despite it being a mistake. However, the voyages of Christopher Columbus, first contact, and early European colonization are also rife with many myths that continue to be perpetuated in our popular culture. Let's begin our discussion of first contact by examining these myths first. Here are some of the top myths about first contact. Myth number 1 is that Columbus discovered America. Not true. We know that the first documented Europeans were in fact the Vikings, a Scandinavian people who beat Columbus to the Americas by hundreds of years. In the 10th century, Vikings explored the coast of Canada and Newfoundland. Myth number 2. Everyone thought the world was flat before Columbus sailed the ocean blue. Also not true. This is one of the biggest myths which continues to be perpetuated. Just about everyone, and certainly everyone educated, knew the world was round. The spherical shape of the earth had been established by the ancient Greeks, and every major medieval scholar agreed. This is not just true of European culture. Other major civilizations had also figured it out, such as ancient China and India. Really, at no point in time were there many people who believed that the world was flat. Columbus was not some sort of mad genius for sailing across the Atlantic Ocean, and no one thought that he was seriously going to sail off the edge of the world. The disputed point was not the shape of the earth, nor the idea that going west would eventually lead to India and China, but the ability of European ships to sail that far across open seas. Myth number 3 is that the Americas were largely empty of people. Again, not true. The Americas were filled with people. They were complex and varied civilizations and lifestyles. At least 50 million people lived in both continents, maybe more. However, once the Europeans arrived and began infecting natives with their diseases, these diseases moved faster than they did, spreading from one native group to the next, traveling far into the continents. These diseases were devastating for native peoples and killed millions and millions of them before they had even had a chance to meet a European. By the time Europeans explored the entirety of the continent, their diseases had already greatly reduced the previous population, contributing to the myth that the Americas were sparsely populated prior to the arrival of Europeans. The next myth is that Europeans conquered America because of superior weapons. No doubt that the Europeans did have superior weapons and other technology. They were, after all, the beneficiaries of a millennia of product development and innovation throughout the Old World and its larger population. So yes, Europeans had guns and the natives did not. However, superior technology is a minor factor compared to the impact of European pathogens and diseases. So what did Europeans know of the world prior to first contact? A good place to start is to take a look at their maps. This is the famous surviving medieval map, the Hereford Mappa Mundi, which was created around 1285 CE. Like other medieval illustrations of Eastern lands, the 13th century map combines known fact with myth. It shows paradise at the top with Jerusalem in the center of the map. The dark area moving out from the center is the Mediterranean Sea, with Europe on the left and Africa on the right. The map is meant to be symbolic rather than geographical, and obviously this is not a map that you would want to navigate by. However, it does demonstrate a fair bit of knowledge about the Old World. What about North America, though? Did Europeans have any idea that it existed? While there were certainly hints in literature and legends, but little definitive proof that they had any real knowledge of the Americas. Out of these references, there are a couple of possible contenders. The first would be St. Brendan, an Irish monk who lived during the 5th and 6th centuries. According to legend, he was in his 70s when he and 17 other monks set out on a westward voyage in a small frame boat covered with sewn ox hides in a journey that would take 7 years. According to the stories, the monks encountered a strange new land that sounds a lot like North America. There is no definitive proof that this happened, and the Brendan tales are filled with many fantastical details, such as Brendan delivering a church service on the back of a whale. There are also hints that Portuguese fishermen may have discovered the rich fish stocks off North America, but kept the knowledge to themselves. The earliest definitive contact between Europe and the Americas was the Vikings. The Norse, or the Vikings, were northern European adventurers and farmers who explored Greenland, Iceland, and Canada during the 10th century. According to their sagas, or stories, the Vikings called the strange land they found Vinland. They built an outpost on the shores of the land and stayed for the winter. Initially, scholars treated the stories of the Vikings as just stories. There was no proof. Then, during the 1960s, a remarkable archaeological discovery was made at L'Anse Meadows in Newfoundland, Canada. The site at L'Anse Meadows offered absolute proof that Europeans reached North America earlier than Columbus. Quite a bit earlier, in fact. They beat him by over 500 years. However, the Vikings only stayed in Canada for a year, abandoning their remote outpost after fighting with local natives and enduring a harsh winter. Their stories were lost to myths and legends, and did not greatly change the destinies of the peoples of either world. By the time Columbus prepared for his fateful voyage, knowledge of the Vikings and their strange discovered land was gone. Knowledge of other parts of the world, that is, the Old World, was much more widespread. Europe was well aware of the existence of China, Japan, and India. For centuries there had been trade between these regions. The ancient Roman Empire and ancient Chinese empires were both aware of each other and wrote about each other. Trade may have passed through many hands, many traders, cities, villages, but objects originating in China show up as far away as England and vice versa. The ancient Greek Egyptian philosopher Ptolemy had written the definitive guide on geography, which became the blueprint for the European understanding of the world. In its greatest work, Geographia and Cosmographia, Ptolemy outlined the extent of world knowledge. He described the placement and existence of faraway lands such as China, India, and the rest of Africa. Another important work which informed Europeans about the rest of the world was the famous travel book written by Marco Polo, entitled Livre de Merveilles du Monde, written in the 13th century. Marco Polo was an Italian Venetian merchant who purportedly traveled to Central Asia and China during the Middle Ages. There is still some debate about whether Marco Polo actually made the journey. However, much of the history and descriptions he relates matches up to what we did know existed in China and elsewhere. It seems, at the very least, that even if he had not traveled there personally, he had talked to somebody who had. In any respect, his book about his travels became immensely popular during the Middle Ages, and Columbus himself has said to have been a fan. There are also examples of individuals from China exploring the rest of the world as well. The most well documented is Zheng Hao, an explorer, diplomat, and fleet admiral during China's early Ming dynasty. During the early 15th century, Zheng Hao led an expedition consisting of a fleet of more than 100 ships to Southeast Asia, India, and East Africa between 1405 and 1433 CE. While the Chinese shipping technology was robust and, in theory at least, sophisticated enough to have crossed the Pacific to North America, there is no evidence that they did. After the brief period of exploration under Zheng Hao, China entered into a period of isolationism and did not venture forth again. The main contact between Asia and Europe during the Middle Ages was an overland route known as the Silk Road. The Silk Road was not literally a road, but rather a long, interconnected system of trade by which products from either Europe, China, or India could move back and forth. The Silk Road was made possible because of the peace imposed on the bulk of the route by the Mongol Empire, which is sometimes called the Pax Mongolia, or the Mongol Peace. The Mongol Empire became wealthy and powerful by facilitating this trade. However, the period of peaceful stability over the land route disappeared during the 14th century, and the Pax Mongolica came to an end. Many scholars attribute the decline of the Mongol Empire to the spread of the Black Death, a pestilence which spread across Asia and Europe in the mid-14th century. The Black Death may have hit the Mongols particularly hard. This created a renewed emphasis on sea routes between Asia and Europe. European countries competed with one another to gain economic advantage and to monopolize trading routes. This competition in turn spurred on technological advances. Navigation aids such as the compass and astrolabe became further refined. Advances in cartography made long-distance sailing easier. By the mid-15th century, the caravel and full-rigged ships were allowing Europeans to sail on longer journeys than ever before. Portugal and Spain were in particular leaders in this ship technology. In this image to the right, you can see an example of caravel-style ships in the harbor of the capital city of Portugal, Lisbon. This is Europe in the 15th century, divided between many states which are often at war with one another. Europe has also become incredibly wealthy as a result of trade with Asia. 50 million people with teeming cities such as Paris, Venice, and London. The trade links which Europe enjoys, however, are fragile. Everything flows from Asia through just one place in particular, Constantinople. Constantinople was the capital of the Christian Byzantine Empire. However, by the 15th century, the Byzantines are under threat from a rival empire, the great Islamic Ottoman Empire, to the east. In 1453, disaster for the Europeans. The city of Constantinople falls to the Ottoman Turks. The Ottoman Empire is the great rival to the European commercial dominance, and once taking control of the city, they largely turn off the taps of trade to Europe. Europe will now need to find a new way to access the markets of China and India. The Portuguese were the first European nation to experiment with new routes, and in doing so they would be the first European country to become involved with the slave trade. Even before the fall of Constantinople, in 1440, Portuguese ships had reached the Gulf of Guinea, bringing back slaves, gold, and ivory. In 1487, Portuguese sailor Bartholomew Diaz had sailed around the Cape of Good Hope. By 1498, Vasco da Gama had reached India via this route. The Portuguese built trading posts all along Africa to India, and now had a viable route to Asian markets. The Spanish monarchy decided to gamble on the ideas of an Italian mariner named Christopher Columbus, who believed that the ocean was crossable. They hoped to find a better route than the Portuguese, who were rivals to Spain. And then, in 1492, as we all know, Columbus discovered America, landing in the Caribbean. Subsequent voyages discovered Mexico and the rest of the mainland. Although Columbus wasn't the first European to reach the Americas, his voyage was different. It would open up the Americas to the rest of the world. Knowledge of these new lands and their peoples spread like a wildfire, starting a bonanza of exploration and colonization by the European powers. Columbus himself didn't even realize that he had discovered a new continent, believing in fact that he had reached India, which is why Native Americans are still sometimes called Indians. The Spanish were the first Europeans to encounter the Mesoamerican civilizations, and thus chocolate as well. In some ways, it was fortunate for the Spanish that the part of the Americas they discovered happened to be the complex civilization of the Aztecs, based in large cities. Like Europeans, the Aztecs were rich in gold and other precious metals. This would prove to be an irresistible temptation to the Spanish. Between 1519 and 1521, the entire Aztec civilization would fall to Spain. Here you see a 17th century artist's impression of the meeting between Hernan Cortes, the famous Spanish conquistador, and Montezuma, the king of the Aztecs. Less than 30 years after first contact, the Spanish had conquered the Aztec Empire as a result of a military campaign of Cortes, and had exerted their dominance in the region. Cortes had famously landed on the Mexican coast with a force of only 500 men. This has led to the erroneous myth that Cortes and his men managed to conquer the Aztecs because of their guns. The truth is that the Spanish exploited the internal divisions of the Aztecs, who had themselves only conquered the region a couple centuries earlier. They found many native allies amongst the Aztec subjugated peoples, which swelled the ranks of the Spanish forces. Coupled with the spread of European diseases, the once great Aztec Empire crumbled in just a few short years. Spain now took complete control of the region, and the European colonization of the New World began. The area of Mesoamerica and modern-day Mexico was renamed New Spain. Slowly but surely, Spanish institutions, religion, architecture, and people began to spread into the new lands and subjugate the native populations. The encomienda system consisted of grants given to Spanish colonists, which gave them control of local peoples. The Spanish conquest was linked to and justified in part by a desire to Christianize the native peoples. Underlying this effort was the racist idea that Indians were a barbarous people who needed to be ruled by the Spanish. First contact initiated a period of widespread cultural and biological exchanges between the Old and New Worlds, which became known as the Columbian Exchange. For tens of thousands of years, the two parts of the world had been isolated from one another. Now they began the greatest cross-cultural and biological exchange the world had ever seen. Crops, plants, and animals which had been domesticated or were simply native to one part of the world now moved to the other. From Europe, grains such as barley and wheat could now be grown in the Americas. Old World products such as sugar and coffee were ideally suited to the tropical conditions of Central America and would now move to be grown there. From the Americas came corn, tomatoes, peppers, squash, and potatoes. As hard as it is to imagine, no European had ever tasted a tomato or a potato prior to first contact. Diseases, sadly, were also part of the exchange. The original inhabitants of the Americas had no natural immunity to many of the common diseases of the Old World. When they came into contact with Europeans, they also came into contact with their diseases, such as smallpox, which proved devastating to native populations. Of course, one of the New World products the Europeans encountered was chocolate. But most initial Spanish reports seem to suggest that they disliked the bitter native drink. Girolamo Benzoli, for instance, wrote in 1575 that it was more a drink for pigs than for humans. Jose de Costa wrote, "It disgusts those who are not used to it, for it has a foam on top, a scum like bubbling." This brings up an important question. Why did Europeans start drinking chocolate if they hated it so much? Or more generally, why and how do cultures assimilate new things? This has been a topic which has attracted much debate over the years. In that sense, we would say that the history of chocolate, as it is told by historians, is not static, but rather it is a changing historiography. One of the earliest suggestions by historians for the adoption of chocolate by Europeans is the transformation of chocolate into a sugary drink. The idea is that the Spanish encountered a bitter, awful drink and then decided to make it better with sugar. Thus, did the Spanish fix chocolate with sugar? More recently, historians such as Marcy Norton, who I mentioned in our first podcast, and whose book is on the recommended reading list for the course, disagree. According to their evidence, the Spanish initially learned to like chocolate just as the natives enjoyed it. The first Spanish drinkers of chocolate may have been the children of mixed marriages between Spanish men and native women. These Creole Spanish were culturally influenced by two worlds, and adopting chocolate spread it from Mesoamerica to Europe. And in doing so, they didn't just spread chocolate, but they also spread Mesoamerican flavors and tastes to European palates. The European adoption of chocolate also came to be dominated by their understanding of medicine, which is one of the topics of our next podcast. In any respect, sugar is a late addition, and certainly not the reason for the spread of chocolate.